Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. Looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 391. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about crawfish boils, Cajun culture, and the Alligator Bayou as we go to Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. We don't have a sponsor this week, but if you have a travel company or destination, we could be talking about you right now. If you're interested in sponsoring the Amateur Traveler, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com. Before we get into this week's interview, I do have three news stories for you. In the first, we've talked about travel to Azerbaijan on the show before. I thought you might be interested to know that the Central Election Commission announced that the president of the country was winning re-election with 72.76% of the vote. That probably would have worked better if they hadn't announced the election results the day before the election. Speaking of saying the wrong thing, a bullet train in Japan was forced to make an emergency stop after a man had warned that there would be an explosion on the train. Apparently, the drunk man thinks that what he actually said was, "I felt like my bladder was going to explode." In other misunderstandings, Burlington International Airport was forced to evacuate because a fire alarm went off because someone burnt toast. For links to all three of those stories, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Lindsay Thomas, who's coming to us from thetravelluster.com and come to talk to us about her hometown of Baton Rouge. Lindsay, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
And I should say you're really coming to us from thetravelluster.com because there's only one L. So
yes.
That way people will know how to spell it if they don't go to the show notes.
Correct.
Excellent. Well, where is Baton Rouge, first of all, especially for our non-U.S. listeners?
Baton Rouge is the capital of Louisiana. It's about an hour northwest of New Orleans. People are usually more familiar with the more vivacious big sister of New Orleans, but Baton Rouge is north of New Orleans.
Okay. And why should someone go to Baton Rouge?
Well, for one, it's not very touristy, so you can really get a good feel for Cajun food and culture that you might not be able to appreciate when you travel somewhere like New Orleans, which is kind of sensory overload. It's a slower pace. It's a big city, but it's not a sprawling metropolitan city, but it's the second largest city in Louisiana. And it kind of started off, I think, a college town. It really grew around LSU, Louisiana State University, and it's evolved from a college town to it's getting to be more of a kind of a metro, entertaining, urban, really great dining options, interesting things to do, and you really get a good feel for Louisiana culture. I think you get more Louisiana in Baton Rouge.
Okay. And you mentioned Cajun culture and Cajun cuisine. So
yes.
Cajun cuisine, I think most people know, a little more spice, but Cajun culture, I'm not sure that everybody does know.
A lot of Acadians came down, French Canadians, and you kind of have that mix of that heritage mixed with sort of the Creole from the Caribbean back in pre-Civil War era. So you had this mix, this melting pot of these different interesting cultures. And not particularly in Baton Rouge, but kind of around the surrounding areas and smaller towns, you get that Cajun accent, and it's almost like a kind of a slang French.
Excellent. What should we do in Baton Rouge? What kind of itinerary would you recommend?
Oh, eat. Eat. Focus on the food.
Well, so if we're focusing on the food, where would we start, or what would we start with?
I think definitely focus on the fresh, amazing Gulf of Mexico seafood. All throughout the year, we have different seafood seasons. So in the spring, you have crawfish season. And something that people might not know about Louisiana is that we take our crawfish very seriously. And we have crawfish boils. And I have a cousin who lives in Japan who has been known to fly home to Baton Rouge for crawfish season in the spring. It's quite fun. I guess it's akin to like a crab boil or a lobster boil or something like that. You just get hundreds of pounds of crawfish and boil them really spicy, and you have all the fixings like the corn and the potatoes, and you sprawl it all out on these tables and have a couple of kegs of beer, and everyone just gets together, and we go through about 4 or 5 batches, and it's just kind of a come and go as you please, but it's a real laid back, fun, good way to get some good Louisiana culture in. You mentioned that the crawfish boils were usually in the spring and crawfish season. Yes. Is there more specific in terms of when crawfish season is? Well, usually it depends on the crop every year. I think last year it started early, and it was really towards the end of winter. So I think the first really healthy batch of crawfish came out towards the end of February, which is pretty early. Usually it's around March. Okay. And then in May, that's really peak season. And then kind of early summer, they get a little bit smaller. Okay. And we're talking about a crustacean very similar to a lobster, almost like a freshwater lobster, but a little smaller. Very tiny, yes. Yep. Okay. Great. What else? My favorite thing to get, 2 of my favorite things, which are probably very Louisiana, fried or blackened alligator and fried boudin balls. Okay. And a boudin ball, for anyone who doesn't know, it's basically, I don't know if you're familiar with boudin, it's like rice and all this stuffing kind of stuffed into a casing and then deep fried. Okay. No, I don't know those. It's delicious. And usually the sauce that you eat with it is very good as well. And when you say blackened, we're talking about served with a lot of pepper encrusted in it, not just that they've left it on the stove too long. Correct. Okay. That's the healthier version. The fried version is probably my favorite. Any other types of food you would recommend? Let's finish this. There's so much good food. And, it's funny, since I've lived away from Baton Rouge, I think growing up there, you take the food for granted. And it's once you've lived away and you've tasted different foods, you realize how amazing Louisiana food is. And it's just so complex and spicy, and there's just so much flavor to it. I love gumbos. So seafood gumbo, duck and andouille gumbo. I love it with okra because it kind of makes it that thicker consistency. Jambalaya is another favorite. Crawfish étouffée, red beans and rice. Po' boys. Crawfish étouffée. Yes. Crawfish and then I'm losing the French word there, so I don't know what we're talking about. You make it similar to a gumbo in that you make a roux, so that thickens the sauce, and then you mix in the crawfish and the cream and the tomato sauce, and it's very creamy and spicy and delicious, and you pour that over rice. Sounds good. Okay. Really good. Now, since I'm probably not going to be invited to your folks' house for these meals, are there restaurants that you would recommend, since we're talking food? Absolutely. Every time I go home, I go to Parrain's, Parrains. It's wonderful seafood, and it's reasonably priced. All of these things that I've mentioned, they have there. There's also Acme Oyster House, which is right across the street, and that's from New Orleans, and they've recently opened a restaurant in Baton Rouge as well. There's also the Chimes, which is owned by the same people who own Parrain's, and that's over at LSU campus. So you kind of get more of that lively college ruckus feel, and they have around the world beers, so their beer selection's amazing. But if you're looking for kind of a nicer sort of lunch or dinner and that wonderful cuisine, Jubin's Restaurant and Galatoire's, and also Mansour's. Those are probably 3 of my favorite restaurants in Baton Rouge. Excellent. And in between meals, what do we do in Baton Rouge? You can go to Alligator Bayou,
Okay.
So this is a place where they offer swamp tours, or you can just rent a canoe and just kind of cruise around the bayou and the lakes.
Now, canoe tour and alligators, I'd have to say those words don't fit comfortably for me in the same sentence.
They're tiny alligators.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, for some reason, the big ones they're not there as much anymore. I've only seen probably max like a 2-foot alligator.
Okay.
Yeah. But it's really atmospheric, and you have the cypress trees and the cypress knees and everything. It's beautiful.
The cypress trees, I understood, and then you said the cypress knees.
So that's a part of the cypress tree that comes up out of the water.
Oh, got it. Okay.
If you've ever seen a movie filmed in Louisiana, you might know what I'm talking about.
Now I've got you. It's almost the exposed root system.
Exactly.
Cool. And you said the tours are on a swamp boat, or are we walking, or?
It's a boat, yes.
Okay.
I've never been on one, but I know that they offer swamp tours.
Excellent. And what else?
Well, there's lots of plantations around within the Baton Rouge area.
Now, would these have been rice plantations here, or what? You're not in cotton country.
A lot of it's sugar.
Oh, okay. All right. Sugar cane.
A lot of sugar cane, yeah. And actually, I've done a tour of a sugar cane factory, which was very interesting. I would recommend that as well. It's called Alma Plantation, and they produce sugar cane for a big chunk of the South. So it's not just their production, but they produce for hundreds of other properties around the South. So it's quite an intense operation. They function year-round. It's interesting. In plantations, I would say Hummus House, Live Oak Plantation, and then kind of going out a little bit, road trip from Baton Rouge, not too far, maybe an hour max. There's Nottoway, there's Oak Alley, and the Myrtles, which is said to be haunted. So those are fun little plantation tours you can take.
And you mentioned going an hour out. That leads into the question of, obviously, Baton Rouge can also be a home base for a larger area. Are there other side trips like that you would recommend while we're in the Baton Rouge area?
Absolutely. I would recommend 2 things. Some people want to go to New Orleans naturally, but if you want to go the other direction, I would say go to St. Francisville. It is beautiful and picturesque. It's very Louisiana small town with the large oak trees, the draping Spanish moss, and it's just straight out of a movie. It's beautiful. And the plantations, some of the ones that I've mentioned, are on the way out there. So you can kind of stop along the way and have a nice little lunch in St. Francisville and just kind of take in the pretty cemetery outside and the quaint little town. Also, an hour northwest is Lafayette, and that is Cajun country. And that's another somewhat large city, but it's still quaint in that it's more centralized and a smaller town than Baton Rouge. But they have excellent music and food, and every spring, right around the time of Jazz Fest, they have what's called the Festival International, I think is what it's called, and they get world-renowned musicians, and it's free. It's a 2-week ordeal, and it's all outdoors, and I went for the first time last year, and it was fantastic. It might even rival Jazz Fest.
Interesting. And you say music, and jazz is one of the 2 types of music I think of when I think of that area, but you also mentioned Cajun music, and I think Zydeco. Am I?
Yes.
Okay.
That is correct.
And is there a great place to go hear Zydeco music if I want to hear that?
I think that's going to be more towards Lafayette and that Cajun country. Yeah, you're going to hear a lot of that Zydeco music.
Now, you also talked about a couple festivals. Let's talk about when you would recommend people go to Baton Rouge. Heat of the summer, going to be a little warm.
Yes. Avoid this summer at all costs.
Mild winters, obviously. But what's the best time of year to see Baton Rouge?
I would say really early spring or really late fall, just because the weather it's really ridiculously hot, and it doesn't cool down until mid to late October at the earliest, maybe even November. And it'll be somewhat pleasant. It's unbearable July, August, September.
And you say unbelievably hot. What kind of hot are we talking about?
Triple digits, but
and then that's with 150% humidity?
Exactly. It's the humidity that kills you. And people who live there will say it's they're so sick of it. It's miserable. It's hard to go outside. I mean, we do have really great air conditions, and you have to have access to a pool at all times. But Mardi Gras is really fun. Also, St. Patrick's Day in Baton Rouge. It's kind of like, it's like our version of Mardi Gras. They shut down the streets. It's fun. There's a parade and a lot of festivities, but it's kind of a family affair. So it's wholesome yet fun.
Okay, interesting.
And then the Jazz Fest, kind of international fest time in May, and there's also some music going on outside in Baton Rouge as well.
Are there other places, if we wanted to connect with Baton Rouge locals, is there an activity or a place that we can go that we could best do that?
Well, there's a website. It's visitbatonrouge.com, and they have a blog. That might be a good resource to connect to Baton Rouge folks.
Okay. And then maybe some of the smaller festivals, for instance, would be advertised there. Okay.
They do. They advertise everything. Any sort of little thing you can imagine is pretty much listed on their website. Another thing I forgot to mention, my favorite time of year is football season. LSU Tigers are very well known, I think. Well, we're a great football team, but it's such an experience to go into Tiger Stadium on game day. And every person I tell them from Baton Rouge, they say, oh my gosh, I think the best time I've ever had was Saturday night in Tiger Stadium, tailgating. It was so amazing. And it really is an experience to have once in your life.
Excellent. So you mentioned that they say that that's their best experience. What's the best day you've had in Baton Rouge? The perfect Baton Rouge day?
It would probably be a game day, a perfect kind of a crisp day, not quite fall in the sense that most people are used to fall, but pleasant. Mm-hmm. You spend the day outside walking around, tailgating and meeting people and hanging out even with the opposite team and just kind of bantering and then going into the game and watching the Tigers win and cheering along. And it's really some of the most fun I think I've ever had in Baton Rouge. Excellent.
What's going to surprise me when I go to Baton Rouge?
Baton Rouge in the last couple of years has really embraced the farm-to-table movement. And that's surprised me because I felt that sometimes when I return home, we're a little bit slower to kind of catch up with the trends there. And the last time I went home, there's a lot of restaurants popping up, and even some of the older, more established traditional restaurants have started doing more farm to table and kind of mixing things up and embracing the local, and it's really refreshing. And they're making a name for themselves in the culinary world. I've written a couple of posts about it. Baton Rouge is definitely gaining some culinary notoriety, which has been pleasantly surprising me.
Excellent. I don't know if you've had a chance to see what the guidebooks say about Baton Rouge. Are there things that people recommend that you do in Baton Rouge that you don't know why people waste their time doing that, and then other things that people really miss that they should do?
If I ever see any recommendations to go to museums or something of that nature, I wouldn't focus on that when you're in Baton Rouge. Focus on the culture, the food. You might not see in the guidebook. The last time I was there, Tony's Seafood Market is one of my favorite places, and we've gone there my whole life. We would go and just get the freshest seafood. What I didn't know is that they also have a spice and seasoning factory in the back of the market. And
interesting. Okay.
It's they produce Louisiana fish fry, which is one of the most highly selling and popular national products. And the last time I was there, we did a tour, and it was fascinating. So I would recommend something like that. There's a local brewery, Tin Roof Brewing. That's an interesting tour. You might not see some of these things in guidebooks because they're newer. I went to a pop-up brunch last time I was there. It was a
Excellent.
7-course beer cocktail pairing.
And everyone may not know what a pop-up brunch is. So could you describe that?
So my understanding of a pop-up anything is that it's basically a meal being served at an establishment that's either not a restaurant, so it could be someone's house or a warehouse, or it's a meal being served at a restaurant during a time when the restaurant's usually closed.
Yeah, so, and I'm used to it being more the former. I know there's actually not a condemned building, but a building awaiting demolition in Toronto where there's a pop-up restaurant, or during South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, there are pop-up hotels. People who are creating hotels where there is no hotel because there's such a need at that time. But I'm not sure that everybody has seen that phenomena.
Yeah, I think it's becoming popular slowly. It's kind of the trendy thing right now.
And then any other things that you would recommend for somebody who's interested in culture or in history of the area?
The whole Huey P. Long thing is interests a lot of people. So go downtown. Downtown's been revitalized in the last 5 to 10 years, and it's kind of a backward city where downtown used to be sort of the center of the city many 50 plus years ago, and then there was urban sprawl and it was abandoned. Now they're bringing people back, revitalizing restaurants and everything. You have the state capitol, which is the tallest state capitol in the country, and the old governor's mansion. And then you can tour the state capitol, and I think there was an assassination attempt. You can see the bullets in the wall where the assassination attempt was. I do remember going and doing that tour and seeing the bullet holes and being somewhat impressed when I was younger.
So for people who especially are either not from the U.S. or not familiar with Louisiana history, we're talking about a politician nicknamed the Kingfish,
yes.
Who is a great Louisiana-style politician, let's just say, a populist, and some would say, well, let's go corrupt. So somewhere in that mix there, really, who proposed a lot of wealth redistribution during the Depression. So a very interesting character, very larger than life sort of person. And I didn't remember that he had actually been assassinated.
Yes.
While as a sitting U.S. senator, and that doesn't happen all that often.
Right. Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of good history. I think growing up there, like I said, I think you take some of that for granted. When you have to take a school field trip, you kind of groan and moan, but it is pretty fascinating.
Excellent. Well, where do they take these school children?
We would go downtown, go to the Mississippi River. Baton Rouge is on the Mississippi River. We would go toward the USS Kidd, which is a battleship, I believe. I remember that being a very kind of cool and interesting trip when I was younger. Did some tours around museums downtown. I think we toured the zoo. But that's pretty much it. I think everything's kind of revolving around downtown. I don't think we did many plantation-type tours. I didn't start doing that until I was kind of more college age.
Okay. Hey, how about this? So you are one of those people, like the rest of us, who grew up in a town and probably thought it was boring and then moved away someplace else and then came back later on. What's one thing that you like about Baton Rouge now that you either didn't know about before or didn't appreciate?
The first thing is the food. And it's not that I didn't appreciate it. I think I just didn't understand how amazing the food was until I couldn't
that everybody else had food like that.
Yeah. And when I wasn't having it every day, I wanted it. And the people are really nice and friendly. I lived in D.C. for 8 years, so I kind of missed that people look you in the eyes and say hello and or really genuinely care about getting to know you and having a conversation with you. I think I probably took that for granted. And it's so green and lush. Even in the winter, nothing ever dies. It's always green. Okay. That's something that I probably didn't really appreciate as much when I was younger.
So last few questions. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Baton Rouge.
Only in Baton Rouge, when you're eating a meal, do you start planning your next meal right away? I feel like it's so
Clearly you've never traveled with my wife, but...
Maybe I need to. I love food so much, and I think it's my heritage, my Baton Rouge heritage that everyone else around me did growing up as well, and getting out of it, you kind of realize you have this food-centric lens on life, and I think I can attribute that to growing up there. Excellent.
Any good money-saving tips for Baton Rouge?
It's pretty inexpensive. I wouldn't worry too much about spending too much money. Transportation, you're going to have to rent a car. We don't have great public transportation, and taxis aren't very reliable.
Okay. Last two questions. Finish this sentence. You really know you're in Baton Rouge when what?
You really know you're in Baton Rouge when you can't have a wedding or a party on LSU game night.
Okay.
It's definitely something that people plan around. My husband and I did. If you commit the cardinal sin and decide to have a big party or a wedding on a game night, people might not show up, or they might bring their iPads or have their iPhones on streaming the game, and that's something you have to expect.
Excellent. Excellent. And if you had to describe it in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Friendly, hot, and yummy.
Excellent. Our guest again has been Lindsay Thomas from thetravelluster.com. Lindsay, tell us more about The Travel Luster.
The Travel Luster is a travel blog I started a year ago, almost exactly. My undergraduate education was anthropology and geography double major, so have been studying culture and people and places my entire life. I travel a lot, and I decided to start documenting and working on my writing and photography and sharing that with viewers.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for coming on The Amateur Traveler and sharing with us your love for your home city of Baton Rouge.
Thank you so much for having me.
In news from the community, we had some great tips on driving in Ireland from Jim this week. Number 1, hug the center line on 2-lane roads. It's counterintuitive because you flinch from oncoming traffic on the opposite side, but if you get too far to the left, you may collide with an expensive stationary object. 2, at a roundabout, if you start to get confused, follow the car in front of you. They know which way to turn at the roundabout. 3, be very careful in car parks/parking lots because your instinct is to go right and their instinct is to go left, and there you go. Number 4, don't drink and drive. It's bad enough sober, so get a B&B within walking distance of a town if you plan to drink at dinner. Number 5, be sure to enjoy the scenery. No place like Ireland. Number 6, have your passenger in the left seat help you navigate tight spaces. It's very hard to judge how much room you have on the left when you're sitting on the right. Thanks, Jim. I would echo a lot of what Jim said, although I found it took me about a day to start to judge my space correctly on the left-hand side. But certainly on the way from the airport, when we were first picking up the rental car, that was a little bit of a problem. Jim left that comment on the Facebook community, facebook.com/amateurtraveler. You can join the conversation there as well. With that, we're going to end this episode of The Amateur Traveler. If you have questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com or leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.